Hey there, 8th graders. These notes and corresponding slides are about Ancient World History 1.2, the causes and the effects of the Neolithic Revolution. So on your unit outline, there are 3 different lessons for 1.2. So the first one is causes of the Neolithic Revolution. The second one is the effects of the Neolithic Revolution. And then the third one is the development and diffusion of Neolithic communities. Diffusion meaning how they spread. So our learning goal is that you should be able to explain both the causes and the effects of the Neolithic Revolution. And we have 2 essential questions that you should be able to answer. The first is, what were the causes of the Neolithic Revolution? And the second one is, to what extent did the Neolithic Revolution end the hunter-gatherer lifestyle? So first we're going to look at the causes of the Neolithic Revolution. So the Neolithic Revolution is that transition from the hunter-gatherer societies that we had during the Paleolithic time to farming communities. And this transition occurred right around 10,000 BCE. The cultivating of plants and the domesticating of animals, so farming, occurred due to people having food insecurity, wondering where their next meal was going to come from. And that food insecurity was caused by several different factors. So the first was climate fluctuations at the end of the Ice Age. So at the end of the Ice Age, climate is definitely different than it was during the Ice Age. And so the humans could not rely on finding plants and animals that they had relied on in the past. Second was increased population. So the more people that they had, then the more competition there was for food with the hunting and the gathering of that food, and therefore the desire and the need to settle in one place and grow their own food. And then lastly was environmental changes, for example, droughts. So farming first developed in the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia. So that is the region right around Iran today and also parts of Egypt. And in Mesopotamia, they grew grain. So the first plants that were cultivated were wild barley, wild wheat, and wild rye. So originally, the first farmers were women and girls because growing plants was very similar to the role in the Paleolithic time in gathering plants. Mesopotamia also domesticated large animals for both food and for clothing. Also during the Neolithic time is pastoralism, and that is nomadic herding of animals. So these are people that are herding animals, and instead of settling in one place, they are wandering from place to place as the animals are grazing the land. So that occurred where farming was not possible. And so the nomadic pastoralists, they traded animal products like their hide, their hair like wool. They traded those animal products for food and materials that were made by farmers. So this was a perfect trading relationship. The beginning of agriculture seems to coincide with humans being able to make more sophisticated stone objects, which defined the Neolithic period. So we got better at making stone tools, much more sophisticated than ones during the Paleolithic time. And so that also seems to correspond to the beginnings of agriculture. So next we're going to look at some of the effects of the Neolithic Revolution. So definitely population growth resulted from greater food security due to agriculture, animal domestication, and sedentism, which is living in permanent settlements. So once people settled one place, their families grew, and their families grew because they weren't worried about food, and also they had animals domesticated that they could also rely on for food. So one of the ways that the Neolithic farmers farmed the land was through shifting agriculture, was also known as slash and burn agriculture. And you see that image in the top right. So they would just take a portion of the land, set it on fire. That fire would then fertilize the ashes of the trees would fertilize the soil. They would farm that land just for a few years. And then while that land was being farmed, they would burn a new section of land so that the burnt trees could fertilize that soil. And then they would rotate to that new burnt land to grow their crops and let the former area of crops, let that sort of rejuvenate. So that is called slash and burn agriculture. Also, sedentism, which is staying in one place, that expanded the life expectancy and population growth. So this image down here in the bottom is an image of a settlement in Scotland. So people tend to settle where they could also have a supply of food. So food surpluses led to division of labor. So you had pottery makers, you had weavers, you had bakers. People became less equal, so you started to have a hierarchy of people. People were ranked above and below other people. And usually the people at the top were the people who were in charge of managing and distributing food. During the Neolithic Revolution, there was lots of innovations that were created. So you have grinders and buffers. That's for the grains that are being grown. And so that is a use of more precise stone tools. Here you see in the bottom left, these are some examples of those from an archaeological site. You also had pottery and baking methods that were developed to help create, preserve, and exchange food. So now that we are settling one place, we need to be able to store our food. We need to be able to have a container to trade food with. And so pottery becomes a really big deal. Also, we have weaving methods. So here, this bottom right, you see an image of ancient weaving from the 5th century BCE. The loom was created during the Neolithic time. You have the invention of the wheel, which is huge, not just for trading, but also for pottery. There's toys that are found with wheels, so it became a really important invention. You had seed and animal selection. So we're purposely growing certain types of plants and selecting animals for certain genetic characteristics. And so this is causing a loss of biodiversity. And then eventually we're going to have metallurgy, which ends the Neolithic period. But in the meantime, you see here are some stone tools in the top left, so much more sophisticated than those in the Neolithic age, and also tend to be more useful for agriculture. So the Neolithic Revolution definitely had some environmental impacts. So to expand the amount of usable land, farmers cleared forests using that slash and burn technique. So when you slash and burn, so when you cut down forests and you burn them, not only are you creating deforestation, but also you are putting pollution into the atmosphere. It also impacted the land by changing forest land to farmland. The creation of water control systems, for example, wells and eventually irrigation, allowed populations to provide water for their crops without relying just on rainfall in their vicinity. And then pastoralism also brought challenges to the environment and the people. So herds of animals concentrated in one place could overgraze the land, making it unusable for the animals and also subject to erosion. So you see on the top right, this is an example of grassland that has been overgrazed. And then also, the closer that humans live to animals, then there was a higher likelihood that diseases could be transmitted from animals to humans. Similar to how they believe that possibly the coronavirus was transmitted from wet markets in China to humans. So lastly, we're going to look at the development of Neolithic communities and the diffusion of those Neolithic communities. So besides Mesopotamia, or the Fertile Crescent, there were 7 other Neolithic farming communities that developed independently from each other. And so you see in source 2, here's a map of those centers, but they definitely all grew different crops. And so you had in the Sudan of Africa, they grew sorghum, and West Africa, they grew yams. In East Asia, they grew millet and soybeans. In Southeast Asia, they grew rice. In Papua New Guinea, they grew bananas, and there's an image. Bananas used to have seeds in them. They're actually part of the berry family. In Mesoamerica, they grew maize, and then in the Andean region, potatoes was the crop that they developed. Farming communities grew outward approximately 15 miles per generation as the populations expanded. So if you think about every generation extending 15 miles, by the end of the Neolithic period, which started around 10,000 BCE and ended around 3,500 BCE, by the end of the Neolithic period, most people lived in those agricultural communities. The first civilizations formed on the banks of rivers around the time of the Neolithic Revolution. So ancient Egyptians were based on the Nile. The Mesopotamians in the Fertile Crescent were based around the Tigris and the Euphrates. The ancient Chinese were based on the Yellow River, and ancient India, that was based on the Indus River. And rivers were attractive locations because they provided a steady supply of drinking water. They made the land fertile for growing crops. They allowed goods to be transported easily. Here's a ship found in what is now Israel. That's between the 4th and 5th century BCE, so we know they were using ships. And then also, they not only allowed people to fish in those rivers, but animals would come to those rivers to drink water, and then humans would hunt them. Lastly, cattle, goats, sheep, and pigs all have their origins as farmed animals in the Fertile Crescent. Those are those large animals that were domesticated, and that was started between 13,000 to 10,000 years ago. And agriculture spread from those eastern regions, from the Fertile Crescent, further west into Europe around 4000 BCE. And there are genetic studies that show that goats and other livestock came along with the farming. Before domestic cattle came to Europe, people that lived in Europe could not drink raw cow milk. They did not have a gene that could digest or tolerate lactose. But today, a lot of Europeans have that milk drinking gene, which proves the vast majority of them are descended from cattle farmers. Here you see in this top left image, these are pottery shards showing this is how they created cheese. Lastly, world population by the end of the Neolithic period, around 3500 BCE, was estimated around 16 million people, and that is a huge increase from 5 million at the end of the Paleolithic era. That's all our notes for the Neolithic age. Hopefully you will be able to use these notes to explain the causes and effects of the Neolithic Revolution.